The final hours of 2025 arrived with a digital thunderclap that shifted the American political landscape once again, as President Donald Trump took to Truth Social to announce a sudden and significant retreat. For weeks, the presence of National Guard troops in America's largest Democratic-led cities had been the flashpoint of a constitutional crisis, but on December 31st, the commander-in-chief signaled a tactical withdrawal. Trump's message was a blend of declared victory and defiant warning, stating that the troops were being removed from Chicago, Los Angeles, and Portland because their mission had been accomplished. He claimed that the mere presence of federalized forces had sent a shockwave through the criminal underworld, supposedly leading to a massive reduction in local crime rates during their brief and controversial tenure. However, the reality on the ground was far more complex than a simple mission complete banner. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the logistics of extraction began, marking the end of a domestic deployment that had tested the very limits of presidential power. This was not just a military move. It was a pivot in a high-stakes legal chess match that had left the administration with few remaining moves in the federal courts. While the administration framed the withdrawal as a voluntary choice born of success, the legal trail leading up to New Year's Eve suggested a much different narrative of forced retreat. Only 8 days prior, the United States Supreme Court had delivered a staggering blow to the White House's legal strategy by refusing to intervene in an Illinois case. The High Court's decision effectively upheld lower court rulings that the president's attempt to federalize the National Guard for domestic policing was a bridge too far under current constitutional interpretations. By the time Trump made his announcement, the Justice Department was facing a wall of injunctions that had essentially paralyzed the troops, leaving thousands of Guard members sitting in armories or hotels rather than patrolling the streets. In Los Angeles, federal judges had been even more explicit, ruling that the administration had bypassed the necessary legal triggers required to seize control of state-level military assets. This legal quagmire meant that the troops in Chicago and Portland were essentially expensive symbols of a power struggle they were currently losing. The president's announcement was seen by many legal experts as an attempt to avoid the finality of a definitive, precedent-setting Supreme Court loss that could permanently strip away executive authority. In California, the conflict had become deeply personal between the White House and Governor Gavin Newsom, who had emerged as the primary architect of the state-level resistance. Following Trump's announcement, Newsom's office did not hold back, characterizes the withdrawal as a face-saving measure for an administration that had run out of legal options. In Los Angeles, the National Guard had already been largely sidelined by mid-December after local officials and the state attorney general successfully argued that the deployment violated the Posse Comitatus Act and state sovereignty. The Justice Department's decision to stop contesting these rulings on December 31st was the final white flag in the battle for Southern California. For Newsom, this was a validation of his state of resistance strategy, proving that the federal government could not simply steamroll state executives without a clear statutory basis. The withdrawal meant that full command and control of the California National Guard returned to the governor, ending a period where the chain of command had been fractured and confused. While the president claimed he was leaving because the job was done, the California leadership maintained that the troops were leaving because they never had the legal right to be there in the first place. Chicago had served as one of the most intense theaters of this domestic deployment, with Governor J.B. Pritzker and Mayor Brandon Johnson forming a united front against the federalization of their Guard units. The city had seen weeks of protests and tense standoffs, not between the Guard and the public, but between federal lawyers and city solicitors. The withdrawal announcement brought a sense of relief to the Windy City, where the presence of federalized troops had been viewed by many as an electoral punishment rather than a public safety initiative. Unlike previous federal interventions, this deployment lacked the cooperation of the local police department, creating a logistical nightmare where federalized Guard members had no clear mandate or authority to make arrests under Illinois law. When Trump announced the removal of the troops, he notably omitted the fact that his administration had been blocked from actually utilizing the personnel for the very tasks he had promised. Pritzker hailed the departure as a victory for the rule of law, emphasizing that the safety of Chicagoans should never be used as a pawn in a federal power grab. The departure of the trucks and equipment from the city's outskirts marked the end of a month of extraordinary tension. Portland, Oregon, a city that has long been a focal point for federal-local friction, saw the smallest but perhaps most symbolic deployment come to an end on this final day of the year. The administration had targeted Portland, citing years of civil unrest, but the local government had been remarkably effective at using the court system to neuter the federal intervention before it could take root. By the time the December 31st order was issued, the Guard members assigned to Portland had been restricted by judicial orders to such a degree that they were legally barred from even interacting with the civilian population in most capacities. The withdrawal from Portland was a quiet affair compared to the high-drama rhetoric coming from the White House, yet represented a significant failure of the law and order expansion the president had campaigned on. The Oregon legal challenges had focused heavily on the 10th Amendment, arguing that the federal government was attempting to commandeer state resources for federal policy goals. With the troops now heading home, Portland's leadership emphasized a return to local autonomy, while the president's supporters lamented the loss of what they saw as a necessary stabilizing force in a city they perceived as being in a state of perpetual chaos. The physical process of removing thousands of National Guard members from 3 major metropolitan areas simultaneously was a monumental task that began the moment the president's Truth Social post went live. Military transport planes and long convoys of Humvees and supply trucks became a common sight on the highways leading out of Illinois, California, and Oregon as the new year dawned. This was not a slow, phased withdrawal, but a rapid extraction, intended to clear the personnel before the next round of court hearings could further complicate their status. Command structures that had been hastily federalized had to be reverted to state control, a process involving massive amounts of paperwork and the transfer of digital records. For the individual Guard members, many of whom had been caught in the middle of this political and legal crossfire, the order meant a return to their civilian lives and families just as 2026 began. The cost of the deployment, estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, became a secondary concern to the immediate need for a clean break. As the troops departed, they left behind empty staging areas and a series of unanswered questions about who would ultimately foot the bill for this unprecedented domestic military experiment. One of the most critical aspects of the president's announcement was his insistence that this withdrawal was not a permanent end to his domestic military ambitions, but rather a strategic pause, by stating that he would return perhaps in a much different and stronger form. Trump was signaling to his base that he was not giving up on the idea of using the military to combat urban crime. This rhetoric served 2 purposes. It allowed him to maintain his image as a law and order leader despite the legal setbacks, and it kept the threat of federal intervention hanging over Democratic governors. White House insiders suggested that the administration was already looking at ways to rewrite executive orders or seek new legislative authorities that would withstand the scrutiny of the Supreme Court. The warning that he would return when crime begins to soar again set a subjective trigger for future interventions, ensuring that the debate over the National Guard's role in American cities would remain a central theme of his second term. For critics, this was viewed as a veiled threat of martial law, while supporters saw it as a necessary commitment to protecting citizens from what they viewed as failing local leadership in liberal-run strongholds. Behind the headlines of political victory and defeat, the National Guard as an institution faced a period of deep soul-searching and internal strain following the December 31st withdrawal. The federalization of these units against the explicit wishes of their state governors had created a crisis of loyalty and a breakdown in the dual-status command structure that has defined the Guard for over a century. Officers found themselves receiving conflicting orders from the Pentagon and their state adjutant generals, leading to a morale crisis among the rank and file. Many Guard members, who were citizen soldiers with jobs and lives in the very communities they were being asked to patrol, felt that their service was being politicized in a way that undermined their mission. The withdrawal provided a necessary cooling-off period, but the damage to the Guard's reputation as a neutral, disaster relief and defense force was significant. Military analysts warned that if the administration attempted a similar deployment in the future without clear legal backing, they might face increased instances of conscientious objection or a full-scale recruitment crisis. The end of the 2025 deployment was a relief to the Pentagon's top brass, who had been wary of the military's involvement in domestic political disputes. The political consequences of the New Year's Eve withdrawal began to ripple through the American electorate immediately, as both parties scrambled to frame the event to their advantage. For Democrats, the retreat was a clear signal that the president's reach had finally exceeded his grasp, providing a roadmap for how state governments could successfully check executive overreach through the courts. They used the moment to fundraise and galvanize voters, arguing that the siege of the cities had ended because of their resilience and commitment to the Constitution. Conversely, Republicans and Trump's core supporters viewed the withdrawal as a pragmatic move to avoid a rigged judicial system while still claiming credit for any perceived drop in crime. They argued that the president had shown he was willing to take bold action, even if the deep state and activist judges had blocked him. As the 2026 midterm elections approached, the image of National Guard troops in American cities remained a potent symbol for both sides. The withdrawal didn't settle the debate. It merely moved it from the streets and the courtrooms to the campaign trail, where the definition of law and order would be litigated by the voters themselves. As the first sun of 2026 rose over the vacated armories of Chicago, Los Angeles, and Portland, the United States found itself at a profound constitutional crossroads. The withdrawal of the National Guard marked the end of a specific chapter, but the underlying tensions between federal authority and state sovereignty remained unresolved and more volatile than ever. The events of December 2025 had exposed a fragility in the American system of checks and balances, showing how quickly the domestic military could be deployed and how aggressively the courts and states would react. While the troops were gone, the legal precedents created during this month-long standoff would influence American law for decades to come. The country was left to grapple with the question of whether the president has the inherent power to use the military as a police force, or if the founders' fear of a standing domestic army remains a guiding principle of the republic. The new year brought a quiet peace to the streets of the three cities, but it was a peace built on the exhaustion of a legal battle rather than a definitive agreement. As the nation moved forward, the ghost of the 2025 deployment lingered, serving as a reminder of how close the country had come to a different kind of governance.